There is hardly a sight more exciting and impressive than the transformation of a pile of metal into a warship. Little by little, the grey colours of maturity were replaced by the red of youth. Day by day, there were fewer and fewer pipelines and electrical cables near the ship. If it were up to me, I would have spent the day and night on my beloved Verbena, but unfortunately it was impossible. There was too much to do. But whenever I went ashore, even for an hour, it gave me an unparalleled pleasure to imagine what I would find my beauty like when I returned. What else would be added to her to make my corvette even more perfect? I must admit, the build was completed admirably quickly. Soon other officers besides myself began to appear on the corvette. There was the artillery officer checking the serviceability of the guns, or the torpedo officer inspecting the condition of the depth bomb throwers. When people around you are constantly changing, you never know how to address strangers. Strange figures in machinists' uniforms crept out of the most unexpected places now and then. The engineer captain, who had crawled out of the propeller shaft tunnel on all fours, looked more like a grimy dock labourer when he appeared than anything else, but he could hardly have liked to be addressed in a way that matched his appearance. Verbena had already become a real ship. The day of her going to sea was fast approaching, and there was still work to be done. I was very busy, but I still could not look at my beauty. Standing on the deck, I had no difficulty envisioning her as a complete ship. Suddenly I realized that as soon as the Verbena went to sea, the most important sound in my life will be the bosun's whistle. Nothing means as much to a naval officer as the shrill, slightly trembling notes of the bosun's whistle. They inextricably link the officer of today with the long-gone captains of the past, and with all those who will come after us. This age-old tradition is not only stimulating and encouraging, it is even a little frightening. Few young captains have such unshakable confidence in their abilities that even in their innermost thoughts they do not allow the possibility of their failure. And that's where the traditions of the Navy come to the rescue. If you think about it, the surest way to help a man gain self-confidence is to remind him of who he is now, who he should look up to. I summoned my wife and children from Liverpool, and we spent 2 delightful weeks together at the Red Car Hotel while waiting for the ship to be delivered. For the first time in a year, I was able to be with my children. I did not know then that I would see them only once next year during the Verbena's short call at Liverpool. I expected that the Verbena would be based in Liverpool, and I would be able to spend time with my family on each port call. It turned out that we were to operate from Londonderry. My wife and I had to decide whether she and the kids would move there or stay in our home in Liverpool, so the kids wouldn't have to change schools. We chose the second option, and I'm sure we did the right thing. Some captains have moved their wives, but I don't think it's fair to condemn wives to a life of anxiety and uncertainty in an environment where no one knows where the ship will be tomorrow. I well remember when the Petunia separated from the group for a special mission, and we heard nothing from her for 6 long weeks. The corvette captain's wife was terribly worried, and we could do nothing to help her, because we had no idea where the Petunia had gone. On the day of the ship's acceptance, the officers arrived 2 junior lieutenants from KVDR and the ship's midshipman also from KVDR. All of them came straight from King Alfred, an officer personnel training base. None of them had a watch certificate. They had all been hastily selected from the ranks of mobilized enlisted and petty officers and given accelerated training to accelerated. I hoped that I would be sent at least 1 lieutenant from the CWR, or at least from the old CWDDR ranks, who could be a senior mate. Not waiting, I went ashore and called Manning. "I apologize," he said, "but I've had to assign an extra officer to all the Western Approaches trawlers. My briefcase is empty. I'll send you XO at the earliest opportunity. Hopefully you'll find someone suitable at Liverpool base. If so, let me know." All I had to do was get back to the ship. Looks like the same man will have to be captain of the Verbena and her first officer. Well, at least there's one good thing about that. If the captain and XO have known each other for 30 years, they should work well together. I was not happy about that prospect. Captain and XO should complement each other. No matter how good the captain is, you can't expect much from the ship without a qualified XO. It can be said that the captain is responsible for the body of the ship and the chief mate for its soul. He is also the conduit of the captain's authority to the crew, and at the same time the representative of the crew to the captain. In many ways, becoming a good XO is more difficult than becoming a good captain. The captain looks only forward, the chief mate looks in all directions at once. Fortunately, the staff of the Second Sea Lord's office knew from experience how hard it is to find a good chief mate and how difficult it is on a ship without one. So the officers did their best to help, and if they were sure they could count on you to help them in return by recommending good officers for promotion, they were quick to replace those who didn't perform well. They did not help two types of captains: those who kept good officers to avoid losing qualified subordinates, and those who gave excellent recommendations to mediocre officers only to get rid of them. During the war, one had repeatedly had the opportunity to see that the more you help the Admiralty staff, the more help you get yourself. There was nothing I could do about the situation. I could only hope that I could get the Verbena through the countless reefs of Tobermory, our training base. There had long been terrible rumours in the anti-submarine party about the excessively high demands made there. It was said that Commodore G.O. Stevenson, the ruling dictator at the base, was completely ruthless and a bit of a crank, but nevertheless absolutely fair, and with a firm hand removed captains from ships, as well as senior and junior officers, and returned the ships for completion. Realizing that training and training again is the basis of any ship's fighting ability, Admiral Dunbar, commander of the Western Approaches Fleet, created this base in the calm waters of Tobermory. At its head was placed a very experienced, meticulous, principled, and extremely fastidious officer, perfect for the position. He could instill fear and often frankly sought to do so. Incidentally, many officers never managed to overcome the high bar he set. But he never once rejected an officer who gave his whole soul to the cause. Very soon we became convinced that the cruel tyrant and cold-blooded despot in reality, a man of the kindest soul. Verbena was commissioned when the portfolio of officers was pristinely empty. For trawlers, crews were recruited from the patrol service, which had a base at Sparrow Nest. On the corvettes, which were real warships, men were taken from the crews of Davenport, Portsmouth and Chatham. On the Verbena, men were taken from Davenport. Her crew was more or less evenly mixed with old service sailors, petty officers, and recently mobilized men. I knew at once that I had obtained a first-class helmsman, for which I was sincerely grateful. On a small ship, the helmsman is the third most important person after the captain and the XO. And in the absence of a chief mate, it is impossible to do without a good helmsman. I had the list of the crew, which meant that it was possible to draw up watch and battle schedules even before people arrived. I was eager to let everyone know from the very first hours that there would be order on the Verbena. By the way, the crew never once gave any cause for alarm. The officers were with me, and we quickly accommodated the arrivals. Half an hour after that, we had the opportunity to let the crew go on leave. However, there were not many who wanted to go ashore. Everyone wanted to get used to the new place, to feel themselves as the crew of a real warship. It was October 4th, 1940. The next day began the acceptance tests. Verbena moved. God, how delightful she moved. My ship went down the river for the first time. A chilling wind was blowing from the northeast, but I was warm, perhaps even hot. I longed desperately to take control, to make her obey me. But for the time being, the pilot had the upper hand. She would only be mine when she showed what she could do, and I signed the deed. For 3 days in a row we went to sea for sea trials, firing and compass checks. Because of the danger of encountering magnetic and acoustic mines, we were not allowed to go over 8 knots, so the engines were not started. This caused the chief mechanic and myself some concern. The fact is that our engines had one peculiarity, which I will tell you more about. In a piston engine, the most important oil seal is the one through which the connecting rod passes, rising and falling as the piston moves up and down. In most 2-stroke engines, this oil seal is made of special metal pieces held in place by coil springs. On the Verbena, segment-shaped parts with disc springs were used as an experiment. It was assumed that such packing was more effective, as it turned out to be in reality. However, as is often the case with small experimental innovations, the matter was not fully thought through. As a result, when travelling at high speed, we always suffered from the malady known as hot rods, which could only be dealt with by the mechanic constantly wiping the rods with an oily rag. Our work as part of the Western Approaches Fleet rarely required us to make long runs at high speed, but still, one day we had to make such a run eastward, and we came up close to the problem. Wiping the rods had to be done continuously. Oil got into the feed water tank and caused problems with the boilers. This very minor defect eventually brought the ship to the Bombay docks for a 9-month overhaul. But engine problems were in the future for now, and in the present I had an equally serious cause for concern: the charts had not arrived in time. It turned out that they had perished in the bombed-out train. Not knowing what to do, I took the maps prepared for Violet, but they were not marked with the current changes, which is extremely important in wartime. I had to hastily adjust the charts necessary for the passage to Tobermory, checking against those available at the naval office. We were ready to put to sea. I signed the deed, said goodbye to the shipyard manager. The Verbena was mine. In the morning I would take her to sea. As I woke up, I heard the wind howling and felt the ship twitching at the dock. There was no need to go on deck to realize a strong wind was blowing from the northeast, so I found myself having to make my first independent decision to sail or not to sail. I had a new ship at my disposal, the engines of which were essentially untested. The way to Peterhead was to be along the lee shore. In such weather, should anything happen to the engines, I could not for a moment stop them for repairs. I went ashore and went to the naval officer in charge. He was surprised to see me. I explained the situation. He was a very busy man who wanted to get rid of the ships cluttering up the harbour as quickly as possible. If you are unable to get the ship out of the harbour, I can easily find someone who knows how to do it. I decided not to take offence and insisted that the matter be put to the Chief of Staff of the Western Approaches Fleet. While waiting for the call, the office owner and I glared at each other with angry eyes. I felt that I was right, but nevertheless felt a certain awkwardness. Unlike me, Nakhtaba had no doubts. We need you very much, but in one piece. Act according to the situation and try to arrive at Tobermory as soon as you can. Back to Verbena I walked with a light heart. In the afternoon the current changed and the wind dropped at the same time. At precisely 3 o'clock we set sail. At the mouth of the river the pilot switched to his dinghy and Verbena was finally mine. I steered her northward on the canal and felt myself the happiest man on earth. My ship had excellent seaworthiness. I had enough experience to feel it as soon as we put to sea. This corvette was the first to have an extended tank. All the previously built ships of this series, and there were about 50 of them, had a passage between the tank and the bridge. This meant that a man going to the living quarters had to first walk across the open deck in front of the bridge, and only then would he get to his destination. On the Verbena, the tank reached up to the chimney, providing us with a shelter where the entire crew of 70 could fit freely. This innovation gave people the opportunity not to get wet, going on watch, and what is even more important, Koki could carry food from the galley to the dining room without the risk of throwing it overboard in the rocking. The first corvettes were very nimble and easily swayed. There was a saying that while on board during a storm, it was impossible to get one's foot in one's pant leg. The additional weight of the bow superstructure made the ship more stable and improved its seaworthiness. In addition, the increased weight of the bow corrected the trim, so speed was not reduced. Moreover, if necessary, Verbena could easily exceed its design speed. On the other corvettes, the picture was the same. The corvette was originally designed as an anti-submarine ship for operations on the high seas. No one envisioned that they would be used to protect convoys on long ocean passages. Now we realize that the best way to sink submarines and protect convoys at the same time is to build special escort ships. At the time, corvettes were widely used for this purpose. In other words, they performed functions for which they were not designed. Nevertheless, after the advent of the extended tank, they became excellent small ships. They were almost never flooded in waves, and generally suffered minimal weather damage. All in all, they were excellent ships, and operating within their capabilities, were active in the Battle of the Atlantic. I could have been the luckiest of mortals, but I was in serious trouble. Having set my course, I brought a cigar from my cabin to the bridge, and settling myself in a corner, prepared to enjoy myself. To my unspeakable surprise, I soon noticed that the people around me looked odd, to say the least. The Aztec operator had turned as green as a canned pea, the signalman was huddled in the opposite corner from me, and looked no better, and the pale blue watch officer was gaping and gulping for air like a fish out of water. I had to take the watch. With the Aztec headphones on my head, I called the wheelhouse. "Helmsman, are you all right?" "I'm fine, sir." Thank goodness. For some reason this place is a mess. His voice, a little depersonalized by the trumpet, was still palpably respectful. Your cigar, sir. Perhaps it's because of it. I guess they're just not used to the peculiar odor. Thank you, helmsman. You must be right. I wasn't thinking. That's very irresponsible of me. A little later, when the watchman had recovered, and we were nearing the lighthouse on the Isle of Farne, I ordered the navigator to locate the ship. It was no use. He looked at me with such genuine bewilderment, as if I had asked him to get the moon out of the sky. They didn't teach that on the King Alfred. Accepting the fact that I would have to train my officers myself, I decided not to waste any time and to start immediately. The watch turned into a rather long lesson. It was good that I already had experience in training junior officers. I had done it before the war, so I had a lot of patience. It was time for the next dog watch. A replacement watch officer appeared, whose knowledge was as extensive as that of the first one. It became clear that I would not be able to leave the bridge until the youngsters had acquired at least basic skills. So I had dinner in the hydroacoustics room, and the first night I did not sleep at all. Only in the second half of the next day, when we had rounded Cape Wrath and had a relatively direct route to Minch straight ahead, did I get a chance for a little nap. I ordered my mattress and sleeping bag to be brought to the bridge and settled down in the ASDIC room, within reach of all the voice pipes, the alarm and the watch officer. In time, that tiny cubbyhole became my sea cabin. It gave the officers confidence, and they felt they could always get timely help if they needed it. And in general, people were calmer if the captain was at hand. Who knows what problems may arise unexpectedly. On a beautiful winter morning 5 days before Christmas 1940, we entered Tobermory Harbour. 4 corvettes were already anchored there. As we approached, we noticed 2 more corvettes and a submarine moving into the exercise area. In the centre of the harbour, the old passenger steamer Western Isles, formerly used for inter-island passenger service, swayed at anchor. Now, in the spirit of the times, it too was painted grey. We were shown a place to anchor. As the anchor sank to the bottom, I took binoculars and began to study the steamer. From the top deck there was an angry face with wispy grey eyebrows and a belligerent stare over eyes that were, as I later saw, sky blue and seemed to see right through you. This was the Tobermory Nightmare, the dictator of the Western Isles. Somehow I knew that when he got us, it would be a big one. I was right. Useful skills were hammered into us efficiently and painfully, and at any moment the command could be heard: lower the dinghy. Drop the second anchor, raise the dinghy. Prepare for towing. Tug the vessel. Send a boarding party to the Western Isles. You've got a crawling anchor, hoist and proceed. Anything could happen. Almost. It did happen at Tobermory, and more than once. The whip snapped and the Verbena had to jump. At first, when we jumped, we screamed in pain. Then we learned to jump silently. To be objective, it must be admitted upon arrival in Tobermory, we could hardly serve as a reliable defence for anyone. After 10 days of hard labour, the day of judgment, came the inspection headed by Nightmare, and his staff came on board. We passed the last inspection, after which Commodore Stevenson came into my cabin and said, "Well, you made it. Congratulations. But you're going to need a first officer. You don't have the strength to pull the load alone. I've already given my opinion to the commander. They'll give you a man in Liverpool. Besides, you'll have to get your vaporizers up and running. I understand you'll now be part of the ocean escort. I expect you for dinner tonight." We put to sea in the morning and set course for Liverpool. No one had taken the trouble to provide us with the notices to mariners, a vital weekly publication vital to any sailor, by which nautical charts are corrected. I had made some changes to the charts in advance, checking against the charts on the Western Isles. I probably had not yet finally realized that at Tobermory we had been certified as part of an ocean escort, and could now expect any assignment. At Tobermory we gained the most important thing of all: confidence. Of course, we were all far from perfect, however, we were doing well. Time will add grease to the wheels, and if luck does not turn away from us, we are sure to become an effective fighting unit. The corvette Verbena was heading south. As we passed Cape Kintyre, we received the commander's radiogram: get fuel at Greenock and join as an additional escort ship to the convoy that will pass Cape Kintyre tentatively tomorrow at noon. Senior officer on the Velox. So in this campaign I had to do without a senior officer, and without corrected charts, so I set course for the Clyde. The sun had long since disappeared behind the clouds, and when we reached the gates of the boom barrier blocking the entrance to the River Clyde, it was completely dark. It was raining. We asked at the signal tower where the tanker was. We were given a berth number, which told me nothing. There was a strong current under the ship, and the silhouettes of anchored ships loomed up ahead out of the gloom. I could only hope that I could use my sixth sense, which was all I had, to steer the Verbena through the anchorage until I saw two blue lights marking a tanker somewhere. I was afraid to glance at the well-lit chart table lest I lose my night vision. That would be a fatal mistake. God, why was I such a stubborn ass and did not listen to Elgood, who fatherly advised me to become an artilleryman? He meant well for me. I would never have had to stare into the darkness until my eyes hurt, looking for a single ship in a crowded anchorage. You can't even see the bow of your own ship. And when I find this damn tanker, if it happens, I'll have to dock on its side for the first time in my life. Well, I'm not in any danger of that. No one will ever find the tanker here. What's that? A light. Well, yes, I can definitely see a light. Two little blue lights, one above the other. Now we'd better turn. Helmsman. Sir? Preparing to take on fuel. We're getting close. Left rudder 15. Hard left 15, sir. I could see the nose starting to turn, but not fast enough. Increase to 20. Hard left 20, sir. RPM. 70 RPM, sir. 110 RPM. 110 RPM, sir. Reduced to 10. Left rudder 10, sir. Small forward. Small forward, sir. Rudder straight. Rudder straight ahead, sir. Helm? Sir? Sir? Can you see the tanker? Clear, sir. Maintain heading for the second boom. Second boom, sir. The quiet splash of water between the converging hulls, the snake of the ends flashing in the darkness. Left rudder 20, centre back. Left rudder 20, centre back, sir. Stop the car. Machine stop, sir. The ship shuddered slightly as it touched the bailing beam. We've thrown the ends over. We're moored. All right, helmsman. Thank you. I breathed a sigh of relief and finally unclenched my hands from the rail. My palms were wet, and so was the rail. I couldn't tell you how proud I was of my ship. It had behaved impeccably when I'd asked it to. The signal came on when bunkering is complete. Anchor at point. Damn it. I thought they were going to leave us here till morning. I went to the cabin to lie down. The tank extension had only one drawback. The captain's cabin was in the middle of the ship and was ventilated only through openings overlooking the deck near the crew mess hall. Through these openings not only air was coming in, but also some remarks not intended for my ear. This time making myself comfortable in my bunk, I heard. And don't argue that only a cadre sailor can steer a ship, said the sonorous voice of a native of the western part of the country. That's how well ours did. And in this darkness, I couldn't think of a better balm for my soul. As I was falling asleep, I thought once again that the Verbena was becoming a real warship. At 3 a.m., we moved to the anchorage, and at 8 a.m., we set out to meet the first convoy. We noticed it not far from Cape Kintyre, two long columns of ships, stretching for almost 10 miles. In front was the USS Velox. A signal light flashed on its side. We were being told our position from the corvette, which was dancing cheerfully on the waves, and yet looked like a fighting ship. We were given all the information we had received, since the convoy had left Liverpool the night before, and a few orders from the officer in charge in case of an attack on the convoy. By the time the signalling was over, it was getting dark. We were on our way to the Minch, and the convoy was to move in 2 columns before passing. Once away from the coast, it would turn in a broad front. Instead of 2 columns, there would be 8, 10, or even more, with 5 or 6 ships in each. The convoy was slow-moving, making no more than 6 knots, so its reforming the next morning was not a quick and easy matter. Some ships could go at a maximum speed of 7 knots, and if those ahead reduced their speed to 4, It took the trailing ships 4 hours to cover 12 miles and take their places in the order. It did not take long for the morning to pass. Velox bustled along in the front ranks. Another destroyer closed the order, and there was a corvette at each corner. The Verbina's place happened to be in the starboard forward quarter. On the first night, nothing unusual happened. As dusk thickened, we changed from a zigzag to a normal course and approached the merchant ships. Navigation lights were not lit, and radar was not yet available in those days. So it was more important to stay with the convoy than to continue zigzagging. In any case, German submarines usually attacked from a surface position, and in such conditions a visual observer has more options than an ASDIC. We all lacked the realism and common sense to realize what would happen if German submarines tried to cut our trade routes in the Atlantic. Before the war, we swelled with pride when we got the ASDIC in service and declared to the world that we now had a decent answer to the threat from German submarines. We did indeed have one, but only as long as the submarines remained submerged. But it was only in the inky darkness of a winter night that the Germans almost always attacked from the surface, and until the advent of radar we could only counter them with our keen eyes, high fighting skill, the ability not to pass up in the face of danger and bluff. We had no other weapons against surface raiders. On the second morning we noticed a long-range Focke-Wulf scout approaching from the northeast at a low altitude. The Germans had stationed some of these pesky nerds at Stavanger in Norway. They constantly got on our nerves and caused us a lot of trouble, until our coastal aviation intervened. If the Germans broke through to the convoy, and they did not stop these attempts, they certainly dropped their bombs on the unlucky merchant ships. But even if the German planes did not succeed in bombing, they still detected the convoys and directed submarines at them. The Verbina's gun crew fired a flare shell. At night, our guns are loaded precisely with flares, and there was no more time to reload. The explosion of such a shell seems blindingly bright even in daylight, and even more so at night. The enemy airplane made a sharp turn. The pilots must not have realized at once what had happened, and we fired another shot. The plane turned away and went off in a northerly direction. Well, Verbina showed its teeth, even if it was not real at first. Although at first the officers who arrived on the Verbina were disappointing in their inexperience, very soon I began to really appreciate them. They were very young, extremely serious, and tried their best. Still, we had a special reputation to uphold, or more accurately, to build. Verbina was the first corvette commanded by a KVDR officer, and it would be many months before a second one appeared. If Verbina proved to be a good ship, it would open the way for many competent KVDR officers to command ships. Thus, we had a responsibility that I reminded people of relentlessly. Before the war, Junior Lieutenants P.M. Whittaker and R.F.E. Pettifer were petty office clerks, and Midshipman C. S. Edwards was a high school student. They served 9 months on the lower deck, then spent 3 months on the King Alfred. And now they're in charge of 30 or 40 merchant ships. Such a change must be hard to comprehend. On his first voyage, the midshipman got seasick. Even I've never seen anything like it. Eventually he gave up trying to force food to stay in his stomach and ate nothing for 12 days. Only drank lime juice with sugar. On his return I suggested he stay ashore, but he wanted to try again. Fortunately, the second time was fine. The excitement was quite strong, but we were not disturbed by the enemy. After 8 days the convoy reached the 20th degree of west longitude. Only up to this longitude we could provide an escort. Here we had to leave the convoy and either guard the return convoy or return home and escort the convoy sailing again. A faulty evaporator had caused salt to get into the drinking water tanks, so tea, cocoa, and all other drinks and liquid meals were slightly brackish. We had given almost all of our supply of drinks from the wardroom beer, lime juice and lemonade to the crew mess hall, but there was nothing else we could do to help people. As I had expected, our helmsman was an experienced and reliable man who could be relied upon for everything. This tall, thin, blonde-haired, and very handsome guy belonged to the best representatives of the pre-war petty officers. He was very neat, and always neatly dressed, even in the middle of the Atlantic. This was extremely important, especially on days when we had a lot of hard work to do, and no time to think about clothes. At such times it is easy to slip into negligence and then into slovenliness, and once on that path, it is not easy to stop. Throughout the war, one insisted that the bridge watchman should be neatly dressed and clean-shaven, and as the watchmen included observers who were changed every 2 hours, the whole crew had to watch their appearance. I am not at all saying that if a ship is not shaved and dressed daily, it will be less capable of fighting. All I'm saying is that a high fighting capability is easier to maintain if high standards are adhered to in everything. In this, our helmsman was an invaluable ally and set an example for everyone. By the way, he was one of the last holders of the rank of chief helmsman. Younger guys were already considered chief petty officer's artilleryman, transferred to a new position. I was very fortunate to get such a man on our little Verbena. He had great influence over the men, enjoyed unquestioned authority, and was able to handle abnormal situations before they became serious problems. Leaving the convoy, the escort set a course back to Minch. Cape Wrath appeared on the horizon. The Verbena was on the left wing, as before. Suddenly we noticed a merchant ship to the north of us. It was clearly sinking. We reported it to the Velox. We got an order from there. Sort it out. A Dutch dry cargo ship is sinking, we reported. I suggest we pick up the survivors. Proceed, but pay special attention to notice to mariner's number. We hoisted sailors from one lifeboat aboard. The group that had gone ahead was clearly visible on the horizon. They were waiting for us. The Velox repeated the signal again. Note the notice to mariner's number. We would undoubtedly have paid attention, since we were so insistently urged to do so, but our notices were buried under the wreckage of a bombed train, at I don't even know what station. We waited until the nearest corvette obscured the Velox from us, so that the senior officer of the convoy would not see our signal lamp, and inquired. What is the notification number? Tell me, please. A minefield was the immediate reply. You're on it, we're not. Good news, I said to the signalman's petty officer. Just don't tell anyone yet. It's not like we can go and abandon the second lifeboat. Of course, sir, he agreed nonchalantly. We can't do that. We brought the sailors from the second lifeboat aboard and reported to Velox. Have taken aboard the captain and entire crew of the Dutch merchant ship, including the ship's dog. Good job, the Velox mumbled. But I'm glad it wasn't my decision. Thank you, we replied. What else is there to say? Only that we should try not to go to sea again without the notices to mariners. We set course for Liverpool. That's where we'll finally get the chief mate, the notices, and get the evaporators repaired. We did repair the vaporizers, we did get the notices, but it was much more complicated with the chief mate. We were told at the Liverpool base that there were no men available. Besides, we were outsiders. Londonderry was our base. That's where we'd find a man. And the officers at Liverpool base have enough to do with their own officers. The Verbena was the first of a new series of corvettes, and there were always people wanting to see her. Admiral Dunbar Nasmyth came aboard while we were still moored. He was followed by an endless stream of visitors. I didn't get a chance to go home to my family or see Elgood. I only carved out time to call the Admiral's office and learned that Elgood was on medical leave. Unfortunately, he was very seriously ill. I can only imagine how proud he would have been of the Verbena. We went to Londonderry. When you leave the cold sea, impassive, indifferent to everyone and everything, and enter the calm waters of the River Clyde, you are immediately surrounded by a peaceful and surprisingly warm, welcoming landscape. You head up the narrow, winding channel, and soon the S-shaped bend in the Lysahali completely hides the sea from you. Nothing else reminds you of its majestic, cold stillness. The ship sails on between the towering stacks of overgrown trees, whose branches barely reach the salt-stained sides. The waves breaking from the bow of the ship, and the trickling trail astern, which for weeks had been lost in the immensity of the ocean, now roll leisurely over the roots of the trees and sway the long strands of seaweed hanging from the half-booms. Another bend in the river, and a view of the charming little town, illuminated by the gentle afternoon sun, opens up before you. Along the shady wharf, the escort ships are lined up in rows. At the beginning of the war, they were mostly destroyers and in need of repair. Over time, the ships lined up in 5 or 6 rows, and almost all were ready to go to sea. But the approaches to Derry had lost none of their charm. We moored aboard an S-class destroyer, whose remarkably graceful contours fascinated me. How often I cast admiring and envious glances in her direction. Furtively, though, I realized that this ship was as inaccessible to me as, say, a battleship. I was absolutely sure of that at the time. But apparently there are still wizards to be found in Ireland, because 2 years later I was commissioned on the USS Shikari and, as senior officer of the 21st Escort Group, commanded 6 S-class destroyers. Captain Rook Keane and his deputy, Commander Slaughter, were creating a huge naval base out of nothing. They gave themselves to the work with passion, without abandon. Warehouses and shore services appeared out of nowhere, as if by magic, and crumbling wharves were made to look decent overnight. I had hoped to find the B-12 group, where the Verbena was to enter the harbour, but it was at sea. In those days, escort ships that could go to sea were not delayed off the coast, so I was ordered not to wait for my group, but to make one voyage to Gibraltar with another. Besides, there were no available exos here either. In Liverpool, they were not interested in me because I was a stranger assigned to another base and didn't try too hard to help me. In Londonderry, I was my own. They were interested in me but didn't help me either. There were no people here, because if they happened to show up, there was nowhere to put them anyway. So I had to go to sea again without a chief mate. We joined the escort of the convoy that had been formed. It is always a considerable embarrassment to the captain if his ship is sent out with a foreign group. Senior officers of escort groups developed special tactics for their ships, introduced special code designations of individual techniques, maneuvers and operations. Later, when Admiral Max Horton became the commander of the Western Approaches Fleet and Captain Gilbert Roberts became his tactical advisor, all tactical issues began to be practiced and unified in the tactical school. The most successful solutions, standard techniques and operations were included in a manual recommended for general use. But all this happened later. And in January 1941, joining an unfamiliar group meant that you were bombarded with an avalanche of code designations, none of which meant anything to you. If you joined a group in the morning or in the middle of the day, most likely the details of particularly complicated maneuvers would be relayed to you by light signals. Occasionally, of course, you might get a watertight packet with all the group orders in it, and even printed. But this rarely happens. After all, you can be recalled as quickly as you were sent, and the senior officer of the escort will lose both the necessary papers and you. Most often you appear in the evening at dusk, when all light signals are forbidden, except for emergency ones. And that's when there's a good chance you'll be awakened in the middle of the night by a signalman with some strange words to say. "Krakatoa, sir." Krakatoa? What's that supposed to mean? Looks like some kind of code designation, sir. I see flares and rockets on the other side of the convoy. Funny group, isn't it, sir? We'd better get to ours soon. At least they speak English. Well, what are we going to do about this Krakatoa, sir? I'm sorry, but I have no idea. We'll take our battle stations and wait. Give me the alarm, please, while I button up my raincoat. But wait for what? An attack by more than one submarine was a completely new phenomenon for us at that time. Therefore, different people, acting independently of each other, tried to find some common tactics, which, when applied simultaneously by all ships of the group, would force the German submarines to go underwater, where they became available to the only anti-submarine weapon that we had in service, Aztec. All groups were looking for a means to accomplish the same goal. Each had developed almost identical techniques and maneuvers, but designated by different code words with which to give the command to proceed. Each senior officer considered his solution to be optimal. It took a lot of effort to convince Commander Blank, for example, that his Operation Krakatoa was essentially the same as the official Operation Buttercup, but if he used the designation Buttercup, then all the additional escort ships that occasionally appeared in the group would know exactly what was required of them. We met the convoy in the vicinity of Inistrahala. It was not going north through the Minch to Canada and America, as our first convoy had done, but in the opposite direction south. It was to reach the 20th degree of west longitude, then turn south and proceed to a point southwest of the Azores, and then disperse. From there, some of the ships proceeded to Africa and some westward to Argentina and Brazil. The remaining ships, under escort, were to go to Gibraltar. When we met the convoy, it had already formed a marching order. The officer in charge looked nothing like the kindly man from the Velox, who had carefully shepherded the newcomer. The weather was abominable, the convoy was difficult, and all our actions were wrong. It should be noted here that for many of the senior officers, excessive fatigue and its attendant irritability is a common condition. In port, they had to divide their time between attending all sorts of meetings, submitting reports to various authorities, and in the meantime they had to pay attention to the group. It was not at all cheerful and optimistic, and there were different kinds of people. A strong wind with rain came from the southeast. Now we had to see for ourselves that no convoys are the same. In the previous slow-moving one, the ships had about the same speed, but this convoy was made up of ships going to different ports and having different capabilities. Instead of 7 knots, we tried to do 9 knots. This was too little for the ships that could go at 16 knots, but too much for the others. The ships were crowding each other like horses in a stall. The ones carrying supplies for the army in Egypt were loaded to the max and sat low in the water. Others were much lighter. The swell and wind carried the lighter vessels out of the marching order. In an effort to get back at all costs, they squeezed more than they could out of the machines, throwing long tongues of black smoke into the air, every escort commander's nightmare. The convoy became more like a herd of sheep than an organized team. While the senior escort officer was tearing his hair out and thrashing around in front of the convoy, the Verbena took up a position behind, trying her best to get the babies who were constantly falling out of the cradle back into place. There was a constant exchange of signals between us and the senior officer. Often it was impossible to read them, because his ship was always blocked by one of the merchants. The signalmen, who had already lost their ability to think, and who were too foggy to read them, kept transmitting messages whether we could read them or not. Number 14 is smoking. Stop it. Number 23 out of warrant. Number 35 is out of order. Why are you so slow to respond to signals? Take the right position. It went on like this for 3 days. All this time I remained on my feet, diligently responding to the incessant stream of signals. At night, when the senior officer behaved relatively calmly, I kept watch, ensuring the safety of the ship. I had no experienced officers, and the weather was such that it required considerable skill to hold my position. It was as dark as the devil's backside, and only occasionally a vague grey spot flashed. It was the trailing ship of the central column rose on the wave, half exposed the propeller, and whipped up a cloud of boiling foam. I slept only 3 hours in 3 days, and not in succession. At last we turned south, or I don't know how much more I could have endured. Immediately after that, I suppose to complete the picture, we entered the fog, a thick, milky white fog that made it hard not only to see but also to breathe. We could hardly distinguish the blurred outlines of our ship. We could see nothing else. But we continued to follow the convoy's course. It went on like that all night, and at dawn, when the fog cleared, we were surrounded by a deserted sea. Not a hint of a convoy. I have never once had occasion to attend a Liverpool convoy meeting, and no one has ever bothered to tell me that this particular commander, for reasons known only to him, always indicates to the convoy vessels a rendezvous point not less than 25 miles behind where he actually intends to be. I received light signals regarding rendezvous points for the next 3 days and, to the best of my ability, went to each of them in turn. At least I thought so, for the weather was cloudy and I could not make up my mind. From the moment we left Inistra Hall, we were all the way down the count. On the Verbena, I was one in several persons, and could not keep track of everything. There could well be a mistake in the calculations. Besides, they included the approximate speed of the convoy. And in general, before radar appeared, the task of maintaining constant contact with the convoy in poor visibility conditions was the worst nightmare of all escort ship captains without exception. Escort ships often lost convoys, but being able to accurately determine their location and knowing the rendezvous points, found them again. It so happened that in conditions of visibility, never exceeding 1 to 2 miles, we reached the estimated point 25 miles from the convoy and did not find it. After 3 days, I decided to follow the convoy to Gibraltar, keeping to its estimated speed and course. I hoped that as soon as I could make up my mind, I would report my whereabouts to the senior officer by radio and request a course that would enable me to rejoin the convoy. It was the season of the Portuguese trade winds, southwest winds that bring low clouds that cover both the sun and the horizon. We had been heading south for 2 weeks, but had never been able to pinpoint our location. One evening, it was about 6 o'clock, we suddenly emerged from the band of fog and found ourselves under a bright subtropical sun. I hastily set about determining my coordinates, but at this late hour I was only able to calculate longitude. We were about 100 miles from Gibraltar, but at what latitude? I decided to steer the ship toward the shore and determine by the stars as darkness fell. By this time I had had a good night's sleep and felt excellent. The crew was working well, and the officers were beginning to gain experience and confidence. In short, the voyage had been extremely rewarding in its own way, and we had experienced many of the difficulties of escort ships. I prepared to determine by the stars, chose 2 stars to the north and east of us, picked up a sextant, and only then noticed that something strange was happening to the horizon line. While I was trying to figure out what it meant, we re-entered a band of dense fog. We crashed into it like a pile of white cotton and became hopelessly bogged down in it. The fog drifted over the bridge, and was quite palpable. It seemed to touch. It clogged our nostrils, it went down our throats, and we wanted to spit it out. From the bridge it looked as if the fog had cut the verbena in half just beyond the chimney. The observers could only sympathize. Above their heads the fog was even thicker. People in the crow's nest could be heard but not seen. I had never seen such thick, viscous fog in my life before or since. Fortunately it was dead calm, which meant we would have been alerted to the approach of a surface vessel by the Aztec. So we moved on. The next morning, no later than 8 o'clock, according to my calculations, we should have seen Gibraltar, or at least one of the capes to the south or north of the entrance to the strait. But we were still moving in fog, so I ordered a reduction in speed. Soon a gap showed in the fog. About 6 miles directly ahead I could make out land. It appeared to be a promontory, but which one? There was a lighthouse on it, and if I could have seen anything but a light spot, I would have identified the cape by the outline of the shore. But nothing but a vague blot of light was visible. We couldn't get any closer. We had to either identify the shore or take depth measurements. While we were measuring, the fog closed around us again with an impenetrable murky shroud. All we knew was that land was close at hand. I assumed that the promontory we had seen was on the southwest side of the entrance to the strait, and we set a course northward, constantly checking the depth and following at a steady pace. Another clearing in the fog, and we saw a low shore covered with red-brown cliffs. It stretched both east and west, crossing our course. In other words, we were heading straight for it. We had to lay down on the opposite course. We could see nothing, and soon we couldn't find the bottom, at least not at a depth of 30 fathoms, which was the limit of my echo sounder. 2 years later I could see a comprehensive picture on the radar screen, but at that time I was at a complete loss. Just before noon the fog began to clear and the sun came out. We were heading south, and could see the shore on the port side high bare hills, a vast sandy beach with a lazy surf rolling in. There was something moving across the sand. It could not be, but we saw it with our own eyes. It was a real camel. We must have been walking along the African coast. I wonder how far we'd gotten. We set our course again and hurried northward. Soon the cape we had already seen appeared, but its outline was also hidden by the fog. A destroyer came out of the fog right on our course. I began to study it through binoculars. On the quarterdeck I could see a stretched awning, which is not the custom on British ships. Apparently the ship was Spanish, and I was too proud to ask a Spaniard where I was. We exchanged greetings with, to my utter amazement, the Spaniard lowering his flag as he passed us. Having the Spaniards to the north of us, and the camels to the south, we could be quite far from the object of our journey. At noon we made the following entry in the watch log, located by Camel and Sombrero 260 Deg Cape Europa 20 miles. We cautiously approached the fog-hidden shore from which the destroyer appeared. The fog did begin to recede, and soon, oh blessed sight, we saw an anti-submarine patrol trawler. I was just about to ask where I was when the fog finally cleared and Gibraltar appeared directly ahead. Good afternoon, the trawler beeped. There was a great shortage of anti-submarine patrols in Gibraltar, so we were detained there for a month. In exchange, they gave us a XO, but demanded one of my junior lieutenants. Who to part with? I had to leave this unpleasant question to the lot. Pettifer left us, which I sincerely regretted, though I would have been equally sorry to part with Whittaker. The long-awaited number 1 was a lieutenant in the KVDR, who had not left the Mediterranean theatre of operations since the beginning of the war. He had sailed on destroyers, was an experienced, very competent officer, But he felt like a temporary man with us. He had only come to the Verbena to make the transition home. So he did his job, but he was not eager to give his whole soul to it, and he was obviously not too interested in the life of the crew. In Gibraltar, our exemplary helmsman almost lost his halo of impeccability. One night, when we were at the quay, one of the petty officers knocked at my cabin. "You'd better come on deck, sir." The helmsman had fallen and seemed to be badly hurt. When he told me the news, he went out the door. I followed. The helmsman was indeed stretched out at the gangway. His face was dead pale, his eyes closed. "Hurry and get a doctor," I said, and knelt down in front of the man. I gently lifted his head to see if he was badly hurt. The helmsman flinched and opened his cloudy eyes. "What's the matter, helmsman?" "It's all right, sir." His eyes, though still cloudy, opened fully. "I was just meeting some old friends. Must have been too much brandy. We reminisced. Could you help me up, sir, and get to my bunk?" Of course. I held his head very gently, like an infant. "Bear with me, they're bringing in a stretcher." The victim was placed on the stretcher. The doctor arrived and found his skull intact, and the helmsman was taken to bed. In Gibraltar we had the boilers cleaned and, in addition, managed to get enough paint and paint the ship. The Verbena now looked delightful. After we finished cleaning the boilers, we were going to go home, but before we did, we had one more patrol in the Straits. All night we were snooping back and forth in the strait, and at dawn we spotted a French destroyer of the Vichy government and 2 merchant ships west of Tangier. The destroyer was sailing in territorial waters. A glance at the chart confirmed my assumption that the Frenchman would probably pass outside the 3-mile zone boundary in Tangier Bay if he stayed on his previous course. The ship was larger than an ordinary destroyer, according to the reference book. The French had super destroyers counter-torpilleers, and the ship Le Malin, which appeared in front of us, belonged to them. From the destroyer we were seen as clearly as we saw him. It carried 55.5-inch guns. I was furious that the Frenchman didn't even think of changing course. I decided that I would stop him as soon as he was out of territorial waters, timing it so that we could approach him just as he was going beyond the authorized boundaries. We went through the strait. The crew of the Verbena took their battle stations, but the destroyer couldn't see it. Standing on the bridge, I turned to Whittaker, who was standing beside our 4-inch. "Mr. Whittaker, when we give the Frenchman the order to halt, put the gun on the alert. If he allows himself to do anything extra, act according to the situation." We were now 2 cables apart. I checked the map carefully. We were outside territorial waters. So was the Frenchman. We laid on a parallel course and hoisted flag K, which in the International Code of Signals meant stop immediately. The order was then duplicated by a 10-inch signal lamp. Our guns were pointed toward the intruder's bridge. There was confusion aboard the destroyer. Men crowded around the guns, which looked toward the bow and stern, but our guns were facing the destroyer's bridge, and we were 50 yards away. The ship swayed on the waves, the muzzle of the guns rising and falling in time with the motion. The grinning gunners were on full alert. I leaned over the side and spoke in the best French I could. The loudspeaker was working well, which was something we didn't get very often. "Pardon, messieurs. Je vous prie de ne pas toucher un de vos canons, et je désire que vous arrêtez votre vassitude. Je vais vous rapporter mon anomalie tête et qu'il me demandera de vous prendre au contraband control." It was the longest sentence I had ever uttered in the language of Molière. So far there was no answer. I could see that a heated argument was going on the bridge of the offending ship, but the noise under the stern did gradually subside. The ship had stopped. We signalled halt to the convoy. He stopped too. I sent a message to Gibraltar intercepted counter-missile destroyer Le Malin outside territorial waters. Request immediate assistance for inspection. The reply was not long in coming. We were instructed to await instructions and the arrival of a destroyer for special assignments. We began to wait. Half an hour later, a destroyer appeared from the direction of Gibraltar. It looked like a man angry at being roused from bed earlier than usual. Puffing angrily with puffs of black smoke coming out first from one chimney and then from the other, it was moving briskly toward us, and from its high foretop the waves were scattering out to the sides like spread wings. A warning light flashed. I am in control of the situation. You must not, I repeat, must not take any hostile action. Well, no means no. We returned to Gibraltar. That same night, someone somewhere woke up from hibernation and realized that these ships were carrying £9 million of polished gold that had been left in Dakar after the fall of France. The gold was on its way to Germany. Orders followed to intercept the cargo at all costs, but it was too late. Le Maillon and his charges fled in the direction of Oran and were never seen again. We were already on our way to England as an additional escort ship of the fast convoy and took no part in the chase. Never again in my life did I have to be so near gold. The return trip went without incident. We arrived home and found our group in full readiness to put to sea. After getting fuel, we joined our own. While still on the approach to Londonderry, I was informed that a chief mate and another officer had been assigned to the Verbena in place of Pettifer. When they arrive, my crew will be really strong. We're finally in the B-12 group. This fact couldn't have been more gratifying. Now we all spoke the same language and felt like we were part of the team, not outsiders. I knew our senior officer well, and he trusted me and didn't pull any punches. I quite honestly thought he was the best senior officer in the Western Approaches fleet convoys. Naturally, he could only have the best group. I think it would not be out of place to mention that the officers of all the Western escort groups, or almost all of them, thought the same thing about their senior officers. I mean to say that very different men on very different ships were united by a commanding spirit, and neither hurricane winds, nor inclement weather, nor the enemy could destroy that fellowship. There was no inequality between the ships. In addition, I believe Commander Howard Johnston, the senior officer of B-12, was the consummate master of tactics. During the terrible months of the summer of 1941, we conducted convoy after convoy without losing a single ship while they were under our protection. It is true that we sank only one German submarine, but as our commander said, our business is to get the merchant ships home. At this stage of the war, sinking the enemy is a secondary task. Our time will come later. I'm sure Commander Howard Johnston's point was quite obvious until we improved our radar equipment. And let the glory of successful hunters go to other escort groups. At least B-12 was getting food into the country. Unfortunately, when the B-12 group was destroyed by the German submarine U-651, Verbena was on the cleaning of steam boilers. The submarine crossed the convoy's course in broad daylight. She did not attack, but was herself attacked by the Malcolm. The ship gave one salvo, after which her opponent went underwater and was under the convoy. When the convoy passed, the German submarine was already met by a group of hunters, which included Malcolm, Violet, Arabis, Veronica, and Scimitar. When the boat appeared on the surface, all hell broke loose as all available guns opened fire. Of interest is the statement of the submarine's chief mechanic, who was the last to leave, that the gunfire did not cause any damage to the solid hull. For the quality-made solid hulls of German submarines, shells of our 4-inch did not pose a danger. They could slightly spoil the appearance, but did not cause serious damage. The achievements of Commander Howard Johnston's group were even more evident because at that period we were operating on H-Falf Fjord in Iceland and escorting convoys going both ways on a stretch between the 20th and 40th degrees west longitude. This stretch, in the middle of the ocean, was the most dangerous for convoys and was considered the most productive for U-boats. We could not even count on air help. As far as I know, there were a few Catalinas in Greenland, but because of the constant bad weather we hardly saw them. Not surprisingly, the good god of convoys, Commander Howard Johnston, was soon transferred from us to the Admiralty. In the middle of May, the group was standing by in H-Falf Fjord. One day I noticed a tall, smiling officer come aboard and walk up on deck. There was something in his slightly careless demeanour that caught my attention, and I went out to greet my guest. His smile grew even wider. Jack Hunter's facial features have already been erased from my memory, but his smile is impossible to forget. The heavier the situation, the more radiant his famous smile became. He saluted and announced, "Lieutenant Hunter. Reporting for further duty, sir." And I realized instantly that I, and all of us, were in luck. He was an experienced, confident officer. Hunter was a Scotsman from the east of Scotland CWDD division. He was in great physical shape, like a rugby team forward, had the pleasant voice of a professional barrister and a sparkling, always splashing sense of humour. In civilian life, he was a humble sworn clerk. If his sense of humour took him too far, his natural charm always got him out of trouble. Where logic was powerless, a disarming smile came to the rescue. He won over the team at first sight, and for the rest of his life. Even now I can't think of him without smiling. As one of our captains said with frank envy, how lucky you Verbinets are. With a barrister as XO, you can get away with murder. The most important part of that statement was the word Verbenians. We ceased to be officers, petty officers and sailors. We all became one big close-knit team, the Verbenians. This new but fully formed community of people was Jack Hunter's contribution to the common cause. He served as a kind of catalyst that helped fuse the separate parts into a cohesive whole. And from then on, if something hurt one of us, it was felt in one way or another by all of us. The feeling of being one with the Verbena people gave me great satisfaction. When I left the Verbena, I never experienced anything like it again until a very different chief mate performed the same miracle on the destroyer Highlander. An officer in command of even so small a ship as the Verbena is a man of willful loneliness. The other officers and sailors assume that he knows much more than they do about the plans for the future. He has to be constantly on his guard not to say anything unnecessary. He is the guarantor of general discipline, the last supreme authority in deciding the fate of violators and petitioners, so he is always suspected of tyrannical tendencies. Officers, feeling that his high position can embarrass them, prevent frivolous pastime, in every possible way make it clear that his company during off-duty hours is undesirable. Hunter, possessing sparkling humour and inexhaustible charm, easily made them forget about such fears. Probably his experience as a barrister had given him some special insight into the weaknesses of human nature. People treated him with absolute confidence, and confided all their anxieties to him without question. If, however, I tactfully decided to refrain from attending a party in the wardroom for fear of embarrassing those present, Hunter invariably came to my cabin and persuaded me to join the others. I don't recall him having to do much, though. He was indispensable in any situation, even something as delicate as releasing offenders from the local police station. Late one night, while anchored in Londonderry, we received information that a sailor had been taken into custody for possession of an object he could not explain. The object turned out to be a massive and remarkably ugly marble clock. The sailor was arrested by police officers as he wandered through the dark streets of the base late at night, carrying this masterpiece by an unnamed watchmaker. He told the police that he had purchased it from an unknown person in a public toilet for the sum of 5 shillings. The story was too incredible to be believed by a normal policeman, but Hunter was determined to get the boy out, if it was humanly possible. The two of us went to the police, but they would not give him to us without the inspector's permission. We had to repeat the visit the next morning. I don't remember what arguments Hunter made at the station, but they worked. The sailor was free, and the 3 of us walked back to the ship, the freed prisoner dragging obediently behind us, bending under the weight of a 60-pound, intimidating-looking watch. Hunter came to us in May 1941, and we almost immediately put to sea to meet the homeward-bound convoy SC-31 at 42 degrees west longitude, that is, somewhere in the Greenland area. The route of the convoy crossed the 40th meridian 150 miles south of Cape Farewell, the southwest tip of the island. This time we were ordered to meet the convoy 2 degrees westward than usual, because a patrol chain of German submarines had been sighted in the vicinity of the 40th meridian. There is little doubt that had there been enough escort ships, the Admiralty would certainly have provided an anti-submarine escort for the entire Atlantic crossing. But there were so few ships at that time that even escorting beyond the 20th meridian was introduced only in the last 3 months. The Germans liked an easy hunt. When we were able to provide escort to the 20th meridian, they took the boats farther west where targets were more easily vulnerable. In early 1941, the escort fleet received substantial reinforcements from 2 sources at once. From our slipways were already in full swing corvettes, they were in service more than 80 units, and, in addition, the Prime Minister agreed to receive 50 destroyers from the Americans. The latter were not ideal escort ships, but they went brave British sailors, and that was the main thing. Each Atlantic convoy was now accompanied by an auxiliary cruiser or an old R-class battleship for protection against surface raiders. Convoy South Carolina 31 was to be brought to the rendezvous point with our escort group by the auxiliary cruiser Salopian, but on May 22nd she was torpedoed and sunk. We arrived at the rendezvous point earlier than scheduled, but neither the convoy commodore nor the captain of the Salopian knew about it. We did not break radio silence. After the loss of the Salopian, the commodore ordered the convoy to disperse. Why this order was given, it is impossible to say. Perhaps the commodore was warned that large enemy surface forces were out at sea to intercept. If so, then his actions are perfectly justified. The rights of the commodore of the convoy and the senior officer of the escort should be clarified. The commodore is responsible for the management and safety of merchant ships, taking into account all possible adversaries. The senior escort officer was to secure the convoy from attack by German submarines. This divided command was in practice quite justified as long as only submarines were a real threat as far as I know. The commodore always agreed to the request of the senior escort officer to change the convoy's course if necessary. In the present case, the commodore of the convoy, deprived of his ocean escort and without any anti-submarine defense, might well have expected a submarine attack. He may have decided to disperse the convoy to scatter potential targets over as wide an area as possible. As soon as B-12 became aware of the dispersal of the convoy, Commander Howard Johnston on the Malcolm and 4 other destroyers headed full speed toward the convoy to try to remedy the situation. Behind them came the corvettes at the maximum speed available to us, and already behind us the anti-submarine trawlers were trying to keep up. The night passed in desperate attempts to gather the scattered convoy. It seemed incredible that the ships had managed to get so far away from each other within 2 hours. Having found 1 or 2 vessels, we escorted them to the flock where, like a restless sheepdog, the Malcolm was darting about, and again went in search of them. Before midnight we managed to collect about half of the vessels and even put some semblance of order among them. A little to the north, Commander J. Bostock on the former American destroyer Churchill collected under the wing 10 more vessels, and with the help of a trawler led them to the rest. Shortly after midnight was torpedoed large Dutch tanker Elusa. In an instant it turned into a giant flaming torch. Black smoke was slowly blown away by the wind. The torpedo-torn side of the ship was spewing burning oil into the sea. Conducting Churchill to windward of the blazing tanker, Commander Bostock brought the ship at right angles to the bow of the tanker. Then completely cold-bloodedly, as if on a drill, remaining some distance from the vessel, which had every chance of exploding at any moment, he threw out a life-preserver with his pants and hoisted aboard all the crew, and even the captain's favourite radio receiver. The latter went to the lifeguard as a gift. All this would not have been easy on a British destroyer either, but on the American such actions required truly extraordinary skill. Work on the former American destroyers was extremely difficult, and there were quite obvious technical reasons for this. For completely incomprehensible reasons, known only to the Americans themselves, they made both propellers rotating in one direction. This had no effect on speed, but it was just as difficult to steer such a ship as a single-screw one. Having completed the rescue operations, Commander Bostock returned to his charges. Early the next day, the Verbena received orders to return to the torpedoed vessel. If it was still afloat, it was to be taken in tow and proceed to tow until the ocean tugs arrived. At the beginning of the war, we salvaged anything that could still hope to regain seaworthiness. As we approached the wreck, we discovered a German submarine that had surfaced. Apparently, the Germans had decided to admire the work of their own hands. The boat was coming straight at us. We took our battle stations and waited. The German made no attempt to dodge. I assumed that the German commander, having spotted us, preferred to take the fight rather than try to take cover at depth, exposing himself to imminent attack by depth bombs. I think I would have done the same in his position. A submarine on the surface is a difficult target. The Verbena is much larger and much more vulnerable. I relayed a message to the Malcolm. Engaging a German submarine that has surfaced near the wreck of a Dutch tanker. I heard that Churchill immediately called from the Malcolm by radio telephone. Verbena has engaged a German submarine. Go to the rescue. Be ready to take a crew aboard. When the distance was reduced to 2,000 yards, I ordered fire. The first shot must have splashed the Germans on the bridge with a fair amount of water. The boat turned away smoothly and began to sink. Our second shell exploded behind her stern. Having closed the watertight doors, we went for a ram, but we lacked speed to execute this dangerous maneuver. Passing the point at which the boat began to sink, we dropped depth bombs from the stern. On the one hand, it was a necessary formality I, in general, did not count on success. But on the other hand, we could have been lucky. The boat dived at speed, and it was very difficult to determine its depth. I suppose the Germans must have had trouble with the trim. He had to use the ballast pumps to restore it. In other words, we had a pretty good chance of locating the boat with an ASDIC. We quickly established clear, steady contact. The German boat was under the Alusa. I tried to attack, but had to abandon this intention for fear of killing the already crippled tanker. We cautiously went around the Alusa and only then attacked. Apparently the boat was damaged because on the water appeared and began to spread quickly oil stains. The boat was moving against the wind. We prepared for another attack, but the boat appeared to turn abruptly and lay on a reverse course. We suddenly lost contact, and when we established contact again, the boat was heading back toward the Alusa. Probably the German knew he was losing fuel and wanted to get under the oil slick blown by the wind many miles away from the damaged tanker. We attacked again. I realized from certain indications that the boat had gone to deeper water, and we didn't have heavy depth bombs designed specifically for such cases, and the 50 ordinary depth bombs on board were almost used up. Churchill was already on the approach, and I decided to wait to target the destroyer. Unfortunately, it was equipped with an outdated model of American sonar, much less effective than ours, especially with deep-sea subs. Having transmitted the distance and bearing to the Churchill, we had accomplished our mission. Now it was up to him. The technique of such interaction was later practiced and perfected. If two ships were operating together, both equipped with radar, and there was therefore the possibility of accurately determining the constantly changing distance, the results were almost always high. At the time of which I am speaking, we were dropping bombs from the Verbena in series of 5. Later it was converted for heavy bombs and the series increased to 10 units, 5 light and 5 heavy. The calculation was that the submarine would be flattened by the explosions heavy shells exploded under the light ones. After the attack we lost contact and hoped that we had sunk the sub. However, there was no certainty, so we stayed put until dawn the next day, May 24th. Then, without clarifying the fate of the boat, but convinced that fuel was running low, we set off on the long 40-mile journey to Reykjavik. Shortly after 10 o'clock we intercepted a message that the Huda had been lost, but at that time we did not know how or where it had happened. Some time later we heard that a British cruiser had engaged and been blown up by the German battleship Bismarck in the Denmark Strait between Iceland and Greenland, that is, 200 miles from us. It was clear from reports from the cruisers Suffolk and Norfolk that enemy ships would pass somewhere in the vicinity. I mumbled to the Churchill, "Your comments?" "Observe and pray," came the reply. Just before luncheon, we spotted a large ship on the horizon heading south. Its hull was hidden behind the horizon line, so it was almost impossible to identify it. I again requested the Churchill, "Should I report what I see?" "Better not," we were answered. "Accurate identification is impossible anyway. There might be confusion. I hope the Suffolk has the situation under control." The ship disappeared to the southeast, and we went on our course and soon joined Commander Malcolm, who had been sent to search for survivors from the Hood. Later Commander Howard Johnston showed me a valise stuffed with wooden planks. It was all that remained of the remarkable British ship. In mid-June we went to Londonderry for another boiler cleaning. We sent 1 or 2 ships with each convoy going home, as it was not possible to perform this procedure at Reykjavik. And we missed a successful hunt on June 29th, culminating in the sinking of the German submarine U-651 by our group. At Londonderry we were told that when the time came for the next boiler cleaning, we would be put in for repairs. This meant that a defect list had to be drawn up and printed in 5 copies. There was no typist or typewriter on the corvette, and no one knew how to type, so we had an endless job of fiddling with a typewriter borrowed from the base with 1 finger. We were rescued by a Mackintosh Navy Women's Auxiliary Sergeant, who turned out to be a treasure. She was the invention of the inexhaustible Jack Hunter, who, in addition to his other virtues, had a talent for imitation. The first time she helped us was when the defect sheets were left in the captain's office. Half an hour later, Sergeant McIntosh telephoned there and told us to print all the documents relating to the verbena immediately. We picked them up the next morning, loudly thanking the kind girl and wondering aloud how many chocolates she would have to buy. The next day, elated at our first success, we brought some more letters and documents to the same place. McIntosh was kind enough to order us to print everything over the phone. And we realized that the proverbial Aladdin's lamp was, in fact, no better than our so fortunate friend. In the evening during dinner, I was called to the telephone. At the other end of the line was a very important lady, an officer of the Women's Auxiliary. She inquired, in a dry and stern manner, who Soldier McIntosh was, and why she, the commander, had never heard that name before. Slightly confused, I replied that the poor girl had just drowned. She had been sucked into a pool on the River Foyle. It's so sad. We are all in mourning. There was an ominous silence. I didn't hear another word. Back in the wardroom, I shared my continuing sadness with the XO. You know, number one, we're going to have a wake. Our battle buddy McIntosh just drowned. That's a given. And since we didn't have a body, the wake was a lot of fun. The next day, Captain Rookheen called me in. I want to hear your explanation of the female auxiliary member McIntosh. Yes, sir, I'm very sorry, sir. Sorry she drowned or sorry she was ever born? Both, sir. Fur. The base will be easier to manage, he sighed, when you and your verbena go for repairs. Go away and try not to make any more jokes or silly jokes, at least at my headquarters. And don't forget to tell your XO what I said. He's a big fan of that sort of thing. Thank you, sir. I was already at the door when the captain called me. Rayner. Yes, sir. I hate to say it now, but I must congratulate you. I felt dizzy. Did the Admiralty confirm the death of the submarine we attacked at the wreck of the Alusa? Hardly. As far as I knew, the case was still in the category of doubtful. The news was different, but no less good. I had been given compliance status. This not-so-romantic promotion meant a great deal to a KVDR officer. Henceforth, my position in the Navy command hierarchy was fully commensurate with my rank. No longer would my precious verbena be the lousy sheep among the corvettes of the Western Approaches fleet. She would now be the second ship in the group, and ships whose captains had ranks lower than her captain, that is, me, would be lower than my beauty. The verbena's position has been strengthened. Captain Rookheen brought me back to reality. You're doing well, Rayner, and that's another reason why you shouldn't allow yourself such antics. Yes, sir. Of course, sir. The counsel was undoubtedly good. But we were all a long way from his own Chief of Staff, Commander Slaughter. He was a truly tireless inventor. I guess it all depends on who's being played. In August, we returned to Londonderry with the group. We were due for a mid-month repair in Grangemouth near Edinburgh. Before we left, we had to organise a farewell party for the band. This was not so easy. After a long meeting with the senior assistant, we went together to a stationery merchant to order invitations, smiling because there was no way of hiding it. From there we went back to the wardroom for lunch. A short time before we had a new officer, Lieutenant Cook. When he heard our proposals, he opened his mouth in surprise and did not immediately remember to close it. He must have thought that he had entered His Majesty's ship, the Dordogne, by mistake, and now he was frantically trying to figure out how to get out of here. Edwards, I said to the midshipman, you will play the woman. Am I? Yes, you will be a very modest, embarrassed bride. Oh, don't worry about it. We'll get you some women's clothes. Whittaker. On Saturday morning you will marry Miss Joyce Edwards. A wedding reception will be held aboard the Verbena. Invitations will be printed and sent out this evening. Number 1 will take care of the cab. We'll invite all the group officers and the captain's staff. By the way, we almost had a problem with the cabs. Turns out they were all booked for the funeral. But Hunter was up to the task. Armed with his irresistible smile, he managed to convince everyone he could that the wedding was more important than the funeral, and the burial was postponed until Monday. Clad in women's clothes borrowed from a friend of mine in Londonderry, the midshipman became a pretty girl. And as the mistress of the clothes had a somewhat boyish figure, they all fitted him. The crew, of course, was kept in the loop and followed the developments with all their attention. At the appointed time, 2 cars decorated with ribbons arrived. One was occupied by Whittaker and Miss Edwards, the other by Hunter and Cook. I chose for myself the role of photographer, and accordingly armed myself with a camera, a shoebox, from which protruded a theodolite borrowed from a surveyor. This cunning invention was covered with a black cloth. The captain and his staff arrived just in time to carry the happy bride, who could not keep her high heels on the gangway, aboard. Number 1 met the captain and led him a long way around the engine room, while I, having hastily disposed of the photographer's paraphernalia, trotted around the engine room from the other side and greeted the distinguished guest formally. When everyone was in the wardroom, the game was over, though not quite yet. We intended, after all, to escort the newlyweds to the train. After the reception, everyone left to go to the station, but it turned out that it was not so easy to do so. The pier was full of sailors from our ship and from other ships. We had to clear the way with great difficulty. In front of the happy couple, the XO walked importantly and threw confetti into the crowd. In general, the send-off turned out to be wonderful. The station was also full of people. When the train started, Number 1, who had got the keys somewhere, locked the newlyweds in a compartment. The train began to pick up speed, and then Jack Hunter, who had finally noticed that the bride was showing all the signs of hysteria, realized that the boys had no money with them. He somehow contrived to hand them 10 shillings through the window. The train left. We thought that the newlyweds would get off at the nearest station, Lysahali, and return, but it turned out that the train did not stop there. It had no stops at all the way to Coleraine. It was time for dinner, and there was no news of the happy couple. It was about 10 p.m. when we received a call from the gatehouse that one of the officers was trying to get a girl on board the Verbena. Jack Hunter was sent to rescue the poor soul. It turned out that 10 shillings was enough to pay the fare and 2 bottles of beer. There wasn't a penny left. This was the crux of the problem, for it was not long before Miss Edwards discovered that there was no way she could do without a penny. A ladies' dressed midshipman could not enter an establishment with "for gentlemen" written on the door, and there was a charge for ladies. And as there was no penny, the boys had to get off the train, go outside the station, and look for a suitable bush. When the bush they were looking for was found, the train left, and on the small commuter lines, trains don't run too often. In short, the party was a success. But not all of our time on the beach was spent in frivolous fun. Our main occupation was training hydroacoustics, artillerymen, hydroacoustics again. In addition, we had to show marvels of dexterity and courtesy to ensure the elimination of breakdowns that occurred at sea, or the introduction of some improvements to increase the combat effectiveness of the ship, or improve the living conditions of people. Incidentally, it was the men sailors, mechanics, electricians who usually caused enough trouble to keep the officers busy. Most discipline offenders who appeared before the captain's menacing eyes, guiltily crumpling their headgear in their hands and lowering their eyes, got into trouble through carelessness. They were late for the bus or forgot to look at the schedule. Sometimes there were violators of a special kind. They didn't care about anything. Something had once turned these people against the service, made them oppose the others. Perhaps it was an unfair punishment, some old case that no one bothered to look into. In other words, some old incident had left an indelible imprint on them. These people are usually older than others and are often the best people on the ship. But they avoid promotion, do not want to take responsibility for others, and therefore behave frankly defiant. At sea, such men are invaluable, but ashore they are a constant source of worry. On the Verbena there were 2 of them, a sailor and a boiler operator. They appeared before my judge's table with depressing regularity, and both of them were inseparable friends. Each time the offences were identical, he was late from leave for so many hours and so many minutes. It so happened that the sailor was a real professional with golden hands, and the boiler driver was not a slacker at all. They knew that if they did not return on time, they would damage the reputation of the Verbena. I had told them that many times. So they made Herculean efforts to get back on time, but circumstances were always beyond them. Once the boiler driver was found crawling on all 4s along the wharf, with the crane rail as his guide, from which he had taken his finger with commendable care. The sailor crawled along the other rail. In order not to lose each other, sir, they were singing all the time, They were so anxious to get to the ship, sir, that we didn't lock them up at the station and brought them here. So you can have them if you want them. Having duly assessed the loyalty of the local police and their willingness to cooperate, we took in 2 emotionless bodies. There's a limit to everything. I gave the perpetrators 2 days to recover. We were already at sea when I sent for the proverbial couple. With an angry parent expression on my face, I waited. It was shortly after returning from Gibraltar. First of all, I must thank you for deigning to return to the ship. You know as well as I do that you have a great deal to do with the capabilities of the crew. When we're at sea, you do more than any sailor or stoker. But your latest insolent escapade has put my patience to the test. Tell me yourself, what am I to do with you? How do I get through to you? I suppose you want to stay on the ship after all, or am I mistaken? No, sir, not at all, sir. Of course we want to stay. It's been a long time since we've felt this good the delinquents reported in unison. You mean you haven't met an idiot like me to coddle you and put up with your antics? No, sir, replied the sailor. It's just that you're being honest with us. Look, I want you both to become senior specialists. Give it a try. I'm sure you can do it. No, sir. Thank you, sir. We'll do it some other time. But why? I'm not even talking about the extra money anymore. But you must have girlfriends. Maybe you're thinking of getting married. Wouldn't it be nice for you to brag to your brides that you've become a chief seaman and a chief boiler machinist? It'll be nice for the girls, too. Bride, sir? The sailor's voice was as shocked as if I'd suggested he get a pet elephant. I knew he didn't avoid female company, so I was a little surprised. Yes, the bride. You know, that's one of the little beauties on the beach. Don't you have any girls you'd like to marry? Marry, sir? But why? No, it's certainly not for me, sir. And why buy a book when you can go to the library? So I backed off. I gave up further attempts, deeming the case hopeless. So I was surprised when, before returning to port, a smiling Jack Hunter appeared to me. Good news, sir. I have 2 men who wish to upgrade their qualifications. One wants to try for the position of chief sailor, the other for chief boiler machinist. The examination was held the same day, and of course both passed. I must say that from that time on both behaved perfectly, and invariably returned to the ship from leave a minute before the deadline, though filled with beer so full that it was almost pouring out of their ears, but I was never in the habit of picking on little things. A month or 2 later, back in port, I found new assignments in the mail for both of them. The Davenport crew, always short of senior specialists, had transferred them to another ship. Although our crew was quite strong, I really hated to let these guys go. But I had no reason to detain them. On the last day of their stay on board, the door of my cabin opened and 2 embarrassed faces peeped through. We just wanted to say goodbye, sir. I remember everything, boys, and would certainly have seen you before we left. We said goodbye warmly, after which they timidly handed me 3 photographs. In 2 they posed alone, and in 1 they posed together. We took the picture especially for you, sir. Few things I value as highly as these pictures. Early in the 2nd week of August we left Londonderry for Grangemouth for repairs. Having settled all the organisational matters, I hurried to my family in Liverpool. We had a great vacation in Ambleside in the Lake District. But fate is fickle. 4 days before the vacation ended, Hunter called from Edinburgh. Something strange is going on here, sir. I can't explain it over the phone, but you'd better come and see for yourself. Okay, number 1. I'm on my way back. We packed up, took the kids home, and the 2 of us and my wife set off for Edinburgh.